Hello and welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Douglas Hanna, a distinguished researcher and assistant professor of management and organizations at the Questrom School of Business, Boston University, as our esteemed guest on today's podcast episode. He studies strategy, innovation, and entrepreneurship in dynamic and ambiguous settings like cleantech, digital health, and pandemic era supply chains, and conducted his doctoral research at the Stanford Technology Ventures Program in the Management Science and Engineering Department at Stanford University. He later worked at the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Douglas draws on and contributes to research and theory in economics, sociology, and psychology, employing variety of research methods including inductive field of research and formal modeling. Dr. Douglas Hanna holds a BA in Environmental Studies from Dartmouth College and an MS and PhD in Management Science and Engineering from Stanford University. In this episode, Professor Douglas will share insights from his research on beyond prototypes, rethinking innovation in complex ecosystems. So without further delay, let's welcome Professor Douglas Hanna to the podcast. Professor Douglas Hanna, it's an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful to be here.
Professor Douglas, can you share an overview of your study and the approach you took to explore and understand this topic?
Absolutely. So this is a study with Shi-Ying Lim, who I met when I was at University of Texas, and she's now a professor at the National University of Singapore. And it's essentially a study of learning and prototyping in very complex, ambiguous environments. We study this specifically in the digital healthcare context. These are sort of digital healthcare care coordination platforms are tools that are designed to connect doctors and patients. And this emerged in the United States as a really promising opportunity around 2010 because of the Affordable Care Act, the HITECH Act, and the growing ubiquity of smartphones. And what was interesting was that this was it was very clear that digital health was going to take off. The future was going to be digital. And so the opportunity is massive, but what that actually meant in terms of the products and the markets was very unclear. So, who are the customers? What products, features do we need? What functionality do we need? What are the business models that are going to make this work? So even though there's sort of a grand opportunity broadly, understanding specifically what that might mean is quite difficult. And so we wanted to understand, well, how is it, and this is a big theme in my research more broadly, how is it that firms and entrepreneurs can learn about what to do in these difficult settings? One way that you might try to look at that would be to get a large data set of firms and sort of quantify their strategies and try to map that to outcomes. And you could do that, and that would be valuable. We take a very different approach, which is a small N comparative case study approach. So we took 5 firms that were founded around the same time, similar types of products, and we go incredibly detailed. So we have interviews with the founders and the executive teams, and with customers, we have very detailed information about the specific product functionality decisions, what features they included, what technologies they used, every interview that they had, every meeting that they went to. And we sort of map that into very detailed case analyses to try to understand, well, what specifically were they doing and why, and how did that lead to different learning outcomes? And then we trace these over time. And what's kind of neat then is that we're able to see a divergence between more and less successful firms, which allows us to sort of intuit, well, what are the successful strategies?
So, Professor, could you summarize the key findings of your study and how they differ from traditional approaches like lean startup and agile methodologies?
Absolutely. So in the study, we end up seeing a divergence between the 5 firms. So all 5 end up struggling with their initial idea, the idea that sort of motivated the founders to go and build a company. And we know that happens all the time in entrepreneurship. It's a very common outcome. But what we then end up seeing is that as the firms tried to pivot and learn and land on a new opportunity, 2 of them were relatively successful. So they eventually found product market fit, they scaled, they deployed to millions of customers, and they're now operating successful businesses. 2 others really struggled. One of them exiting in a fire sale, the other sort of bumping along for a long time without really ever achieving product market fit. And then one of them struggled for a number of years before changing its approach and eventually finding product market fit. And what is interesting is that these winning firms ended up having a pattern of behavior that was common to one another, but relatively unexplained or inconsistent with the literature. And in particular, if you think about frameworks like lean design or agile, or more broadly, what we teach entrepreneurs in business schools like this one, there's often a really big emphasis on building prototypes and MVPs and validating ideas. So the idea is let's build something, ship it, try to get feedback, respond to traction, and improve it on the fly. And we see that, in fact, some of the firms did that, but those that did really actually struggled to learn. And instead, what the firms that were more successful and that achieved product market fit more quickly did was they avoided building prototypes and deploying them to customers. And instead, they really sort of did a wide-ranging exploration based on interviews and observations in order to try to understand the nuances of the market and potential value propositions. And then, once they had a promising pair, they went all in. And they worked very closely with alpha customers to co-develop products, develop specialized content, build out rich feature sets and functionality, even though this was an unvalidated opportunity. And so that's actually relatively inconsistent with what I would have taught my students prior to embarking on this research.
Your research followed 5 entrepreneur ventures over 6 years, and it's a very long period. What were the most surprising insights that emerged from this long-term study?
So I think there are a few things that were interesting. I'm somewhat biased, but one of the things that I think is key is that we really emphasize prototyping and MVPs. That is just, it's in our lifeblood. It's in everything that we teach entrepreneurs. And I think one of the things that was so fascinating was that it actually really didn't work very well. Um, the other thing that I think was surprising was that we typically would caution entrepreneurs, I would caution entrepreneurs, and I do with those that I work with, to avoid big specific investments for unproven customers. If you are investing a lot of time building a functionality out, conducting studies, investing in specialized technical architecture and relationship specific things, there's a lot of risk with those investments, because if that opportunity doesn't pan out, you may end up losing that. And startups have limited runway. So any amount of time and effort and money that you put into exploring and building out one opportunity is time that can't be spent doing other things. And one of the things that we see in this case, it's quite interesting, is that the firms that actually do build out these specialized assets early on were able to pivot effectively. And in some sense, they were actually more effective in their learning over time than those that were sort of engaging in rapid iterative prototyping.
Professor, you argue that in complex digital ecosystems, early prototyping can be misleading. Can you elaborate on why this happens?
Yeah, so this is a really important boundary condition of our study, or it's an important motivator for our study. So ecosystems are settings where you have complex interdependencies between different technologies, products, services, and actors. So the world is becoming more digital, there are richer data flows, there are richer financial flows, and firms are ever more connected. And what that means is that actually deploying a product or service often requires working with a much larger set of actors and navigating a much larger set of technological interfaces. And that ends up doing a couple of things. One is, if you envision the world sort of like the opportunity space as a landscape, right? It's much peakier. It is much harder to predict using intuition and logic and past experience where the opportunities lie, what might be attractive. And a small tweak in a feature design or a customer identity could dramatically change traction and uptake. And so in this sort of greater complexity, it becomes much harder to predict what might be a good idea and what might be a good opportunity. At the same time, in these ecosystem types of settings, you typically need to have greater buy-in and collaboration with partners, right? So no man is an island ever, but in an ecosystem setting, we are especially interdependent and need to work together in order to deploy new products and services. And that means that your success can hinge or fall on how successful you are in attracting support and co-development. And I can give you a brief example of this, I think, because this sounds a little bit abstract. We had one firm in our sample that we called Nudge, which is a pseudonym. But Nudge, what they tried to do was, their initial idea was to build essentially an app that would use behavioral nudges to help patients have better health outcomes, right? So better diet, better exercise, or you adhering to your medication regimen. And they thought this would be great for companies like insurers, right, which have a very strong interest in keeping patient populations healthy. Maybe doctors would be interested also. And so they went out, they built this app, they sort of rapid prototyped it, they built a working app set, they tested it with their friends, they got positive feedback, and they said, great, it's time for let's actually go shop this around. And they ended up fairly quickly getting a partnership with a major insurer. And the major insurer promised to make the app available to their patients. And so this was a huge win for a small startup, a massive legitimacy granting partnership with a major insurer, a major player in the space. And this insurer pushed the app out. And what Nudge found after a couple of months was that there was very limited uptake, there was very limited use, and they really had no good sense of how or whether their technology worked. And the reason when they ended up stepping back, what they ended up learning was that they were one of 32 different apps that had been pushed out. And the insurer basically was just as skeptical, just as curious about the technology as they were. So whereas Nudge approached it like, well, let's just build a lightweight prototype, get it out and try to get feedback. The insurer was saying, well, sure, let's partner with a bunch of different companies, deploy their products and see which ones stick. So nobody's actually investing in sort of building out the technology in a way that works, provides value, and helps patients. And the patients themselves, maybe they downloaded it, but they never used it. And so, if you think about it as a relationship, no one has committed. And because no one is committed, it isn't going anywhere. And so the promise is still there. Everyone still thinks digital health is really neat, is really, going to be a big future, but the devil's in the details, and no one has actually worked out what the details are.
Instead of prototyping early, your study suggests searching more broadly first. How can startups and firms implement this approach in practice?
Yeah, and that's a really important question, right? And it's a danger of academic research is that we step too far away from, well, what does this actually mean in practice? And so what we end up observing here is that the firms that were more successful engaged in this broader search. And what the broader search was they avoided building and deploying prototypes to customers early. So they weren't sort of capturing and instantiating their ideas and prototypes. Instead, they were going to conferences. They were talking to networks, their peers in their networks. They were actually sitting in different practices to try to understand. And give you another example. There was a firm, one of the winning firms that we call Stardoc. It was founded by a concierge physician. So he had a tremendous awareness and background in medicine. And despite having a product idea for a patient kind of communication platform that he thought was going to be good, he avoided building that prototype out and trying to deploy it, and instead actually spent time going to practices and sitting and on trying to understand the nuances between different markets. And in doing so, discovered a lot of nuances and sort of differences between different markets, between different value propositions. So I think the short answer to the question, it's interviews, it's observations, it's all of the stuff that actually designers have known for a long time, and good designers do, but it's often somewhat in conflict with what we would teach entrepreneurs.
Your research highlights the importance of identifying alpha customers before committing to product development. How should companies go about finding these customers?
Yeah. Well, so that's $1 million question, right? Or maybe the $1 billion question is if you're deploying products by actually building and co-developing with customers, how do you find these customers? And we know a lot about this from entrepreneurship research more broadly, right? So professional networks are extremely important. Investors are important. Mentors and angels are important. But we also see for these firms that this early broad search was really important in surfacing potential alpha customers. So this Stardock example that I just gave you, or that I just mentioned, is a nice example of this. Essentially, this doctor, even though he had his own medical practice, he started actually visiting different practices, and in doing so, basically started to realize differences between different types of practices. And so he realized, for example, that neurosurgery practices and orthopedics tend to have fairly high complication rates. And their patient interactions are bounded around particular events, like a surgery or a procedure. And that means that the use of a tool to communicate with patients, to follow up, to make sure that they're doing okay and they're recovering properly is really, really valuable. And so these particular practices, while everyone's interested in digital health broadly and everyone's interested in keeping their patients healthy, these practices in particular are going to be uniquely interested in a product like this. And he had already visited practices. He had already made contact with managers in these practices. And so he was able to sort of approach them and say, hey, let's actually think about working together. But one other thing I would add is I think a mistake that we often make is we think about customers, and we'll use the term like, well, the hospital is the customer, right? I'm in Boston here, and I say, well, Boston Medical is a potential customer. Boston Medical has thousands of employees, right, and hundreds or at least dozens of different departments, and so it's less about the high level sort of institutional or organizational customer and what is the personal connection inside? Is it the chief innovation officer? Is it somebody in the digital healthcare? Is it somebody in patient management? And understanding who that specific individual is and getting buy-in ends up actually being quite important also.
What are the risks of committing too early to an initial set of customers, and how should firms decide when to walk away?
Yeah. So So as I said, and as we know, entrepreneurs, ventures have limited runway, right? You have a certain amount of time and investment money. The market may be moving quickly. And any time that you spend working with one set of customers typically means that you are not spending time and money working with others. And so the whole challenge is, can you hit flight? Can you gain sufficient speed and to take off prior to running out of runway? Um, and and when do you walk away from a set of customers that actually is not as promising as you had hoped? That's a hard question. I'll say from my work more broadly, I don't know of a hard and fast rule or a universally applicable heuristic. I don't think that Xiang and I observed one in this study, but I do think one of the things that we observed the successful firms doing is they noticed when there was a difference between the demonstrated technical success and the willingness to pay. So, the goal of many of these products was to deliver better patient outcomes at a lower cost. And they did that. And so, one firm, we call it Good Health, for example, they were working with hospitals and they said, hey, we're able to deliver 3x better patient outcomes at like a third of the cost. That's a tremendous delta for you. You should be falling all over yourself to purchase our product because we know from your data, from your context, that it works. And the hospitals really weren't biting. And that's when they were able to step back and say, okay, it isn't the technical success here that's the issue, right? It isn't our product. There's something else organizationally going on that's preventing them from adopting, and they may not be the customer for us. So I think it's maybe in this case, it was the difference between technical success and the business case that drove that decision.
Professor, given that firms today operate in highly interconnected, data-driven ecosystems, what skills or mindsets are more crucial for leaders navigating this landscape?
Now, that's a neat question. And it's one that I've actually done research on with other authors as well. I think Xiang and my work touches on this. I've also done a number of projects with Timothy Ott, who is at the University of North Carolina. He's a strategy scholar there. And he and I have a few projects that look exactly at this question. So there's a big emphasis today, as I said, on rapid experimentation, on A/B tests, on formulating hypotheses, and trying to get feedback to validate ideas. And this can be extremely helpful. We know that, right? But I think one of the things that Tim and I have started to argue, and others in the field as well, is that this sort of emphasis on validating specific assumptions can end up undervaluing or overlooking slow, reflective thinking and discovery, right? Intellectual curiosity. And what we see in a lot of our work is that actually some of the richest theorizing, the most generative ideation, and the novel discoveries really come from managers or entrepreneurs that are intellectually curious and are actually able to sort of say, I don't have an idea to validate yet, but I have a hunch that this is important, and I want to go in with an open mind and generate data and learn and see what novel questions that prompts, right? So we talk about known knowns and unknown unknowns. And in entrepreneurship, it's often the unknown unknowns that are so important, and those can be really hard to test and validate. Um, there's actually a lovely Jeff Bezos quote. I've got it on my wall over here because it's so central to a lot of the work that I do. I think this was from a stockholder letter, shareholder letter, rather, that he had a decade ago or so. But Jeff Bezos wrote, that basically wandering in business is an essential counterbalance to efficiency. He writes that you need to employ both, and the outsized discoveries, the nonlinear ones, are highly likely to require wandering. And I really love this idea because entrepreneurs are pushed to be efficient. They are pushed to try to validate, get feedback, and discard ideas as quickly as possible. And while that is absolutely critical, being thoughtful, being curious, being hungry in that way is really important too. And I think we end up overemphasizing the engineering aspect and underemphasizing the design and art in entrepreneurship also. And so I think that's perhaps a skill set that I try, or that I think this research suggests, and that I try to cultivate in my own students.
How should investors and stakeholders rethink their expectations when funding innovation in complex ecosystems?
Yeah, so that's another interesting question. So here I would point listeners to Ron Adner's work. Ron Adner is an ecosystem scholar at Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College, and he wrote a book a number of years ago that was called The Wide Lens. And I like this metaphor that he uses. The wide lens is essentially the idea that as the scope of interdependencies between actors increases, as we get into more ecosystem dominant settings, you need to essentially have a wider view of the playing field. And there are more ways to sort of get things wrong. There are more actors you need to consider. There are more kind of interactions that you need to account for. And that would be true for entrepreneurs and for firms. It's true for investors as well. And I think maybe, and this is now, I'm somewhat off of my comfort zone, but I would say I think for investors, maybe the implication for ecosystem settings is that the variance in outcomes is going to increase. So there are more ways to go wrong. There are more bottlenecks. There are more co-innovation failures. There are more small complementers that get squeezed out by powerful platform owners. But at the same time, the rewards are higher too, because for the firms that are able to really capitalize on the network effects, own their ecosystem, you end up with a much, much larger prize.
Are there particular industries or sectors where avoiding early prototyping is especially important?
Yeah, so I would have a slight caution here. I don't think that we want to say we're avoiding prototyping. Prototypes can be tremendously useful for understanding the technical features of an idea, for testing ideas within teams, et cetera. I think what our study shows is that deploying these prototypes to customers and to partners is potentially problematic because that's, in these settings, essentially firms need to engage in collective learning. And I'm only willing to learn if you are willing to put in your time and effort also. And that's where prototypes start to fall short. So it's really about deploying these MVPs that I think is maybe we need to tweak. Um, Given that, I think as complexity goes up and the need for partner buy-in goes up, that's where the sort of minimum fidelity needs to increase also. In healthcare, we have the added issue that we're dealing with people's lives and with people's health. So you have a highly regulated sector that's highly risk averse with real outcomes if we get it wrong. And you can't just try it and see what works, which works in some tech sectors in the healthcare sector. And so maybe that would be the short answer there. Prototyping is always important. Deploying prototypes needs to be done very carefully, especially when working with customers. And it's as the complexity, risk aversion, capital intensity goes up, that's where we really start to see prototyping taking a backseat to a more design-oriented approach.
Professor, my last two questions. The first one, if companies move away from early stage prototypes, what alternative methods should they use to test feasibility and potential market fit?
So that's a great question. And I mean, I think that what Shiying and I identify is exactly the set of strategies that could be valuable for settings that are sort of more complex, where prototypes may be more problematic, or deploying prototypes may be more problematic. It's as things get more complex, it's moving away from this mentality that I think we often teach, which is just ship it and improving on the fly. Um, Really doing this diligent research that designers honestly have known for a long time and that is good design work. We talk about the importance of customer discovery and entrepreneurship, but we also then sort of say, well, let's prototype and get those prototypes out the door also. But the key is that prototypes end up sort of capturing some idea, some value proposition, some set of features and functionality, and that's what you end up testing. So it's a much more deductive kind of mindset. And I think good designers and good entrepreneurs in complex settings really need to try to understand who their users are and the nuances of markets and where one market ends and the other begins, which is a very subjective and very important distinction. And there, it's really the tools of design that become important. So interviews and ethnography and observations and these more sort of sociologically and psychologically grounded concepts.
Professor Douglas, my last question. What are the biggest misconceptions about innovation and product development that you hope this research helps to correct?
No, I love that question, right? Because we're always trying to improve our science, we're always trying to improve our teaching. And I think that essentially this project and a lot of my work more broadly sort of pushes on this emphasis in research and teaching and entrepreneurship now, which is a move away from rapid prototyping and a just ship it mentality. So if you think about like lean design, lean startup, and agile methods, and some of the related frameworks have really become dominant over the past decade. And these frameworks arose out of Silicon Valley in a time when Web 2.0 was sort of taking over the world. You had increasing, everything was online, everything was digital. And in this type of space, you can do a lot of wonderful testing. And I think these frameworks, to a certain extent, were developed as a reaction to older modes of business strategy, which were like business planning. And business planning is you're trying to develop a very detailed flowchart document that says, here's what we're going to do in each case, and here are the financials associated with it. And in a world that's fast and digital and dynamic, it doesn't work. It's too cumbersome, it's too complex, it's too slow. And so, against that backdrop, lean and agile and related kind of scientific entrepreneurship methods are incredibly valuable. And so, I think then what we're starting to argue, and others, who are part of the same sort of emphasis, is that while lean and light and flexible can be helpful, it can't just be lean and light and flexible. It also needs to be thoughtful and understanding how these elements fit together and how different markets differ, and really using the tools of design in addition to lab bench science and engineering is really important. I think my work pushes on that agenda. I think it's a critical insight more broadly.
Very insightful. Listeners, Professor Douglas Hanna's insights have provided a fascinating perspective on rethinking innovation in complex ecosystems. His research challenges conventional approaches to prototyping and highlight the importance of understanding broader market dynamics before committing to product development. As businesses navigate increasingly interconnected and data-driven environments, his findings offer valuable lessons for entrepreneurs, strategists, and innovators looking to make informed decisions in uncertain landscapes. Professor Douglas Hanna, thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. It has been a pleasure discussing your work, and we look forward to seeing how your research continues to shape the future of strategy, innovation, and entrepreneurship.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Professor.